Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of Kabir Considers. In this video, I'm going to react to could US citizens fight off the military? Now, my initial impression is no, just because, obviously I'm aware that US citizens, have, a lot of firearms. Firearms are legal in, I think, most of the US, or if not every state, but to varying degrees. I'm not sure on the technicalities, but just the US military has way more weapons available, like when it comes to things like aircraft and, tanks and, and not even stuff like that. If we just look at the tactical knowledge, the training, everything that goes into being, the world's effectively best military, I just don't think that the citizens could, come together. But then again, the citizens vastly outnumber the military, probably something like 100 or so to 1, maybe even more than that. So, there is power in numbers. It makes for a very interesting thought experiment, but I would still, it's a tough one. I would still have to give the advantage to the military, just because, even though they're vastly outnumbered, the weapons they have at their disposal, you just cannot. The missiles, not even talking about the nukes, just the missiles. But yeah, this should be a very interesting video. Let's do it.
The United States has, without a doubt, the most heavily armed population in the world, with firearms being a part of daily life for many Americans. While in many nations, the mere sight of a gun is an extremely rare occurrence. In the US, some studies say there are almost as many guns as there are people, while others say there are more. What is known, though, is
I would have to guess there's probably more, because you got to account for the ones that are sold unofficially, things like that.
Is that much like American income, the majority of guns are concentrated in the hands of a minority, with 3% of gun owners owning half of all guns in the United States. With this much firepower available to the citizens of America, does it really stand a chance against its own military? The US military needs
Yeah, that's a big point, because unless those 3% distributed the firearms evenly to make sure that everybody had at least one, yeah, man, just immediately they're at a big disadvantage.
No introduction. It has the world's largest budget, more than the next 7 competitors, who are in order: China, Saudi Arabia, Russia, United Kingdom, India, France, and Japan. Of $1.6 trillion spent on military budgets around the world, the United States accounted for 37% of the world total. All that spending goes to support the largest military presence on Earth, with American bases spread out across every continent except Antarctica. Greatly mistrusted for its all-encompassing reach, U.S. national strategy is in fact to avoid another major war, such as the 2 world wars and the countless wars that rocked continental Europe for centuries. U.S. forces are therefore pre-staged in potential conflict zones, where in conjunction with local allies, their presence alone is a deterrent to violence. The results are hard to argue with, seeing as there have been no wars between major industrialized powers since the end of World War II.
Yeah, it's an effective strategy. It definitely is.
The US may not necessarily field the best technology in every department. For instance, the Russians have for long fielded more sophisticated anti-air and electronic warfare weapon systems, but it does bring a unique capability that no other nation matches: the ability to field advanced technology across the board, and not just in select areas. This makes the American military a lethal force against any modern adversary, and has historically forced its major political adversaries to seek out niche strategies for holding the US at bay. Russia, for instance, has for decades focused not on stopping a US offensive outright, but in denying it the air power that would lead to a quick win. To this effect, they've focused on anti-air weapon systems to knock US planes and cruise missiles out of the sky.
This is quite interesting. So it seems that Russia has quite good anti-air systems, and I think the US has just agreed to send F-16s to Ukraine. So what are the prospects for those F-16s, causing damage to the Russian, offensive in Ukraine? Aren't they just going to get shot down quite quickly? Or, has the US sort of preempted this and, found some way to get around it.
And advanced electronic warfare systems to disrupt the networked abilities of American weapons. While China tries to slowly build a naval presence capable of standing up to the US, it relies on a huge stockpile of ballistic missiles to deter the American Navy. In fact, China is the only major power in the world to have an arm of the military dedicated solely to ballistic missiles. Yet, while the US military has proven time and again it dominates the modern battlefield, it has historically had the exact same troubles that every other military has when it comes to fighting low-intensity counterinsurgency wars. When denied the use of its overwhelming firepower and technological advantages, the US military is in the same boat as any other nations and must rely on low-tech, door-to-door action against insurgent forces who don't use heavy equipment and don't wear uniforms. For all its military might, even the American military has great difficulties in fighting an insurgency war. Should the American people ever rise up against their own government, and that government authorize the use of military force against its citizenry, the American insurgents will find themselves in an initially favorable position against the American military.
But then as soon as the military and the Air Force in particular mobilized, they could just start carpet bombing. Just from high up, just drop the munitions. You would take out so many.
For starters, US forces are widely dispersed around the world, meaning that unlike most nations, the least number of American combat troops and equipment is present at home as compared to overseas. For the first few weeks of the war, the insurgents will be able to carry out large-scale operations that will become impossible once more and more military equipment returns home. With the largest air and naval transport fleet in the world, this initial tactical disadvantage the military will find itself in will quickly be reversed. American insurgents could think themselves safe from major retaliation, seeing as no country ever truly wants to destroy its own infrastructure just to defeat an insurgency, let alone the world's richest nation whose cities, highways, railways, and ports are all vital arteries of global trade. Yet one of the US military's major tactical advantages against foreign adversaries will prove just as deadly effective against an insurgency. Smart weapons were first developed to take out pieces of Soviet hardware from afar with pinpoint accuracy. The ability to strike a specific target from hundreds of miles away was a major technological offset and a capability that Cold War Soviet military planners greatly feared. An inventory of networked American bombs and weapon systems could decimate entire troop formations and camouflaged artillery positions with ease, while Soviet planes would have to rely on traditional and very inaccurate gravity bombs and unguided rockets to strike back with. Smart weapons eventually spread around the world, but to date, no other nation has as large a stockpile or integration as the US. With the ability to strike at pinpoint targets and avoid collateral damage,
I'm just trying to think of how the citizens, could use their numbers to kind of to overcome this massive disadvantage in terms of the aircraft that they'd be up against. I guess maybe if they were to storm the hangars and maybe, stop the planes from taking off, I guess that could work. Oh, man. But other than that, I can't really think of anything.
Insurgents will quickly find themselves prey even in the heart of major cities. American surveillance assets are also amongst the best in the world. Having a nearly 20-year insurgency war under its belt, the American military has finally tuned itself for counterinsurgent operations and is today the leading counterinsurgency force in the world. Not only has it developed a slew of surveillance technologies to better locate and disrupt insurgent operations hiding amidst a civilian population, but more important, its troops are highly trained in conducting urban warfare ops and the traditional fight for the hearts and minds. When the Soviets rolled into Afghanistan in the 80s, it did so as the world's biggest military juggernaut and crushed all stand-up opposition. However, within weeks, the war shifted from a conventional one to a counterinsurgency and war of attrition. The Soviets responded much in the Soviet way. Overwhelming firepower delivered very indiscriminately, and soon Soviet forces found themselves unable to operate outside of heavily fortified positions. Any Soviet foray into the countryside would have to be conducted with large amounts of manpower and heavy fire support, and often it simply wasn't worth it. The Americans, on the other hand, initially did much as the Soviets, wiping out major military opposition within a matter of weeks with overwhelming firepower. However, it was here.
I guess one thing that's not really been discussed so far is that the military is obviously made up of Americans. So, it would take a lot for people to turn against their own families, their own, friends, stuff like that. So I guess would it, like, obviously this is a purely hypothetical situation, but I just don't even think it could actually ever really happen. But yeah, that's no fun. Let's pretend it was going down.
Clear that they showed a better aptitude for fighting an asymmetrical war against a non-conventional foe. Wherever American firepower went, it was followed by major civil relief programs with a focus on building infrastructure and restoring, if not improving, the lives of the civilian population. Very quickly, a complex system of diplomatic agreements and alliances arose between U.S. forces and the dozen of disparate groups who all claimed some piece of Iraq or Afghanistan for themselves. Ultimately, the effort would result in a half-won victory of sorts, which was still light years ahead of the total defeat suffered by the Soviets. Unfortunately, the US's insistence on fighting two insurgency wars simultaneously would force it to divide its assets and ultimately result in the mixed results we see today. Yet all the expertise, technology, and troop experience gained from the insurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan would come into play against the US insurgents, and this time the US military will find itself with major advantages it lacked in the Middle East. For starters, it has home field advantage, and its forces are no longer operating within a culture they don't understand.
That's a big point. The military, will know like the country inside out. They'll be so familiar with the areas, the terrains, tunnels and stuff like that. Probably even better than just the average Joe citizen, because they'll have blueprints. They'll have access to like blueprints of cities, so they'll be able to get to key areas, via tunnels and stuff that people won't know about. Like, they'll have the element of surprise.
Very well. Cultural misunderstandings will be impossible, and by understanding the American culture, the U.S. military can better win the fight for hearts and minds, turning many would-be insurgents from their path and garnering the support of civilians who would have instead supported the insurgents. Secondly, it'll be fighting to unite a nation which actually wants to be united and has a national identity, making the process of re-establishing a stable political system far easier than it was in the Middle East. Iraq had huge sectarian divisions that plagued the country for decades and were barely kept in check by the authoritarian strongman. Afghanistan was itself also held together only by the very violent Taliban, who regularly used military power to enforce its grip over the people. Without these authoritarian figures forcibly uniting the nations together, Iraq and Afghanistan quickly fell to pieces that were very difficult to put back together. Afghanistan would prove especially difficult, as its people simply lacked the desire for national unity that nations in the West have had for centuries. Americans, however, have a very strong sense of national unity and lack the sectarian differences and ideological conflicts that would see the nation split up into a conglomerate of cabals in the case of national government collapse. Sure, Democrats and Republicans may often be at each other's throats, but ultimately, as national tragedy after national tragedy has shown, the American people stand united. As the old adage goes, you're allowed to fight with family and call them names, but if anyone else tries to hurt your family, then you better watch out.
Absolutely.
This sense of unity will make the job of counterinsurgency far easier on American forces than it was in the Middle East.
Yeah, I think if ever such a thing was to actually happen, which it would never, but let's pretend it would, I think it would be over quite quickly. It would be over quite quickly, just because these are your brothers and sisters that you're fighting, really. Like, just as soon as lives start being lost, I think, just the appetite for continued battle would be quickly sort of diminished.
And make it far more difficult for American insurgents to exploit a mistrust of the U.S. military. Yet, while American insurgents are outgunned by the American military, they can take advantage of asymmetrical tactics to all but nullify the U.S. military's overwhelming firepower. By following the same playbook as the Iraq and Afghanistan insurgencies, American insurgents could force U.S. troops into close-quarters battles where they couldn't bring fire support, such as airstrikes or artillery bombardments, against them. American insurgents would also be able to enjoy the advantage of fighting a near-total urban warfare campaign, given the size and scope of U.S. cities. As the first part of the 21st century has proven, urban warfare is the great equalizer between military powers, as it denies most of the technological advantages of a nation's military. Fighting instead is door-to-door.
But this is also, you're assuming that the citizens would, continue to get ammunition. If they ran out, aren't a lot of the suppliers of the rounds and the bullets, aren't they from military sources? To be honest, I haven't got a clue. I don't know. Or do civilians produce their own, bullets and stuff.
Door and house to house, carried out by individual squads of soldiers and little more than rifles and gadgets they can carry on their person. With the US military numbering at just over 1 million, and with potentially millions of American insurgent forces, victory for the US military will be all but impossible. A fight between the US military and US citizens would be a dragged-out affair that would likely last as long as the overseas insurgencies. It would be less a war of weapons and more a war of words, with both sides trying to sway the majority of the population to its side. It's likely that in such a war, entire cities would go rogue, with local city governments refusing to outright support the US military or the insurgents, and simply wishing to be left out of the fighting. They would deny the military the right to operate in its streets, but also not wish to support an insurgency which will bring military action against it. Despite the huge glut of guns available to American citizens, the truth is that there'd be no major resupply effort courtesy of an outside power. In the Middle East, Afghani and Iraqi insurgents were kept well supplied by Iran, Russia, China, and Pakistan, amongst other actors, and trade routes into war zones often went through Pakistan, who refused to allow US forces to operate inside its borders and shut them down. In an American insurgency, however, there would be no neighboring power to supply the American insurgents.
Really? Oh, that's true, because the US military is, very close, obviously, with the UK, Canada, a lot of the Western European militaries as well, and like NATO. Oh, that's a good point. That's a good point. Who would be the allies for the citizens?
And the major trade routes into the US through which arms supplied by a foreign power could enter would all be very easily monitored and shut down by the US military. Within a year or two of heavy fighting, the American insurgency would find itself very low on ammo and very low on usable equipment. Yet the war would take a huge toll on the American economy as well, which would in turn directly affect the budget of the US military. With major parts of the economy disrupted by fighting or sabotage, the US military budget would rapidly shrink, and it would no longer be able to afford to operate its vast fleets of modern equipment. In the end, a war of attrition would settle in, and a winner is all but impossible to declare. It would come down to a sheer matter of will and which side would be willing to sacrifice the most to come out the ultimate victor. Yet as each side became more desperate, their actions would lose the support of the population they'd rely on, and thus lose the war for the hearts and minds. Who do you think would actually win a war between the US military and its...
Very interesting video. It's not as, simple as I thought, not as cut and dry. Like, I thought initially that the military would be very fast and devastating, but because the relationship between the military and the citizens is basically they're intrinsically linked, eventually neither side would be able to keep up the fighting, because the military relies on the economy for its funding, and so on. It's just it wouldn't be a sustainable war, and obviously it would never happen. It would never ever happen. It just would never happen. But very interesting thought experiment. Let me know, guys, who do you think would come out on top? I'm sure a lot of you have some very interesting thoughts and opinions on this. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.